Hey, this is Susie. Welcome to episode 5 of 7 of the Luke Experiment podcast. In each of these episodes, I've been joined by a group of students who've brought their own different perspectives to our discussion of the Luke Experiment. Now, this is a reaction podcast, so if you haven't listened to part 5 of the Luke Experiment, go check it out at storycambridge.uk and then come back and listen to this. The Luke Experiment was made by a group of Cambridge students. They've read out the Gospel of Luke, which is a first century account of the life of Jesus. And in this episode, we were discussing part number 5. And I was joined by Tim and Louis, and I really loved chatting to both of them. In our discussion, we got thinking about some great questions about morality and evidence, what it means to have faith. It really got me thinking, and I hope it does that for you too. Enjoy. Cool, thanks for joining, guys. Where are you both calling from?
So I'm back home in Gloucester at the moment.
And I'm calling from London.
Nice. And I understand that you both used to live in Gloucester. Can you just catch us up? How do you both know each other?
So we went to secondary school together from when we were 11, same secondary school in Gloucester, and have known each other a frighteningly long time since.
That is terrifying.
Why is it terrifying? Because you know so much about each other? Or?
Yeah, you know, when someone remembers you when you're 11, you're like, I'm not sure I want them meeting anyone.
Yeah, it's quite good when you come to university and nobody's seen your kind of messy hair, braces days. Although I think I still had braces when I came to university. There we go.
There's a certain vulnerability about someone who knew you before your voice broke, I think.
I find that too, no. Well, it's great to have you both with us. And so, Tim, you are studying at Selwyn, right?
Yep, so third year law. That's fun.
Nice. And Louis, are you also a student right now?
I am a student. I'm at Imperial, studying engineering.
Cool. We've got a visitor from another university. It's exciting. Well, I'm really glad to have you both. I'm looking forward to chatting to both of you, hearing your perspectives on the bit of Luke that we've been listening to. But Tim, first of all, you voiced lots of different lines throughout the whole Luke Experiment. And were you the devil in the first episode?
I was, yeah.
I have to say, I think that was my favourite bit of the whole thing so far in terms of the voices.
Oh,
anyway.
I can't stand listening to it.
What was your experience like of reading all these different parts? Presumably, did you have to read the whole book of Luke in order to see how they all fitted in?
There was a lot of sort of jumping between, and it was quite an odd process just sitting in a room reading random bits of a passage to myself out loud. But yeah, it was very interesting just sort of going, okay, how, I don't know, when you're acting something out a bit more, there's a bit more like, okay, how would that actually have played out? Which is, just a different way of hearing it, I think.
Did you find that you saw any of it in a new light or learned anything from reading it in that different way?
I think one of the things was I did the voice of, I think, quite a few of the angels, and just going, it's the amount of times they start with, don't be afraid, or, something along those lines. And you go, okay, what am I picturing? What is the situation that is so immediately terrifying? And yeah, I have no answers, just thought sort of
more terrifying than an 11-year-old Tim, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, he was just more weird than anything, but
yeah. Oh, and so Louis, what's your experience, what's your background with all of this? Have you read any of Luke before?
So this is the first time I have listened/read to a Bible passage, probably for 5, maybe even more years. I'm not someone who is a practicing religious person, and I'm not someone who has very strong opinions, but I wouldn't describe myself as someone who reads the Bible. So it was actually very interesting to come back to it. My perception of it, previously was something that was really quite impenetrable. So coming back to it a bit older, and even being able to understand what was being said was actually quite an interesting experience.
Were there particular parts of it that you can remember thinking, "Oh, I think I understand that now," or
So
"I'm coming at this differently"?
I think the sort of the bit that made me sort of the bit that sort of made me click the most was probably the parable of the lost son. Just in that sort of immediate excitement you get from, I know this one, I've heard this one. And I remember that story being told to me a lot. And I went to a Christian primary school, and I remember that very vividly from there. So that was a sort of an oddly exciting thing to come across that again. Was like, oh yeah, I do remember that. Otherwise, no, it's just interesting, I think, to see something, to engage with something you don't normally engage with is an interesting thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. What was it about, apart from it being familiar, was there anything about that particular parable of the lost son that stood out to you?
I think in a way, so that one, I think, of the fairly large number of sort of parable stories that were told in that section of Luke, that one's almost one of the easier ones to grasp, in that the message there is quite, it's a story about forgiveness inherently, I would say, which is a part of Christianity, I think, that is easiest to kind of to be like, I can see why this is important. I can see the value in forgiving people. I can, it's not at all hard to see why that story is told, in a way that I'd say potentially some of the other parts of, some of the other parables, maybe it's harder to see, or not necessarily parable. I honestly know what defines a parable and what's not. So sorry if I'm using that word far too freely. But I think some of the other stories that were told in this section were harder. I was like, what's the motive behind this? It's harder to see, I think. That one was easier.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, isn't it, about parables? I wonder, Tim, as you've probably read this a few more times in the past, when you come across a parable that maybe is a bit confusing, what do you do? I mean, what do you think of when you think of a parable? What is it to you?
Yeah, I think it's sort of the way Jesus explains concepts through sort of anecdotes and stories, and essentially just sort of a elongated metaphor. And yeah, I think there were actually bits in that I was going, have I heard this before? Or and a couple of the parables going, oh, actually, I'm not sure what to do with that sort of straight away. And I think a big part of that is then context and going, okay, well, what's he talking about before and after? Where in the sort of whole narrative of Jesus's life is he talking about this? So I think in this it's a lot. It's at the party with the Pharisees, so all these sort of religious leaders, and they're then talking about God, and so I think one of them mentions what heaven will be like, and sort of what's God's feast, what's God's version of a party, and then from that he goes into sort of the string of parables. So I think, a big part of it is the context. So I think the one that I kind of got quite confused about was the manager one. If that's
can you recap that parable for us from what you remember?
Yeah, so off the top of my head, so there's a manager and a servant, and the servant's about to be fired, and then he goes, I know what to do. I'll just go to everyone who owes the master money and basically half their debt. And at the end of having done this, the master then goes, yeah, well done, you can stay on. And there's this bizarre moment of going, he's just like, you've just lost a whole bunch, and this guy's been kind of underhanded and has been rewarded for that. And so if God is the master in the in this metaphor, then what's that about? And I think part of that is actually in the context of all these parables, that think, like you said, Louis, there's a whole block of them together. He sort of jumps on to the next. And I think throughout them there's sort of this theme of, say, sort of forgiveness and generosity. That it's just generosity to the point of sort of it's madness. It's harmful to the self to be that generous. And so when you have this master who a forgives the servant, lets him keep his job, but also what the servant does by sort of halving everyone's debts is make the master look really generous, and the master at the end goes, that's what I want. I want people to know that I'm really generous, and absurdly so, and that ends up, the servant gets away with it because the master wants people to know how generous he is. I'm not sure I can swear everything in that parable, and there's still a lot of it that confuses me, but I think that I would really want to read it in the context of all the ones that come before it, like the prodigal son one you were talking about.
I think I would definitely agree. Like that was one that I was like, huh? What's going on here then? That's like, have I missed something here? So it's kind of reassuring to know that you maybe share that thought. I think there's a lot of and I guess the point of these things is to provoke you to think about them, isn't it? And in a way, if they were all easy to understand, it might be quite boring. But there's definitely trains of thought that I don't quite follow in some of the and another interesting one for me was whether it was a parable or just a story of the two men outside the temple, and the first man broadly in his prayer says, "Thank goodness I'm not one of the bad people," and the tax collector, who I believe is a sort of a symbol of a bad person throughout the Bible, or someone who's perceived to be bad, says, "Forgive me, I've sinned." And the parable then praises much more heavily the tax collector. And from the outside perspective, I think the guy who's sort of standing there saying how marvelous he is sounds like a bit of an idiot. But I find the religious sort of the religious aspect of this idea of sin, I find that very hard to engage with. I find, I guess it seems to me like anyone who follows Christianity acknowledges that they are fundamentally sinful. And that to me is something that I find quite hard to wrap my head around, because it seems like a very bold thing to say about any follower of God, and there seem to me to be a lot of incredibly good people who are devoutly Christian, who I would not feel necessarily I would not want to be like, you have done bad things. And it seems, to me, it seems that there's a certain assumption that you as a person have done bad things, and you should repent that. I guess that was one of the ones where I felt like I'm not quite sure what this is getting at,
Yeah, I think for me, I think essentially it comes down to when you say everyone's sinners. That language might not always be helpful, but I think it sort of comes down to actually no one's perfect. That's what we mean, and that actually, when you compare to a God who is all loving and is perfect, we all fall short. And then from there, there's a sense of, if no one's good enough, then we are equal. And I think, there are degrees of bad, but I think there is this sense of, well, if I'm not perfect, actually it doesn't really, when push comes to shove, what's more, the gap between God and me in that sort of imperfection is bigger than me and anyone else. And so yeah, when it comes to that sort of, the Pharisee, that sort of religiosity and going, well, thank God I'm not them kind of situation. I think for me, it weirdly reminded me of this is a bit of a tenuous link, but so as a kid, when your parents say, "Oh, do the dishes," and I would always complain like, "Well, I've done more than my brother has. Like, I've done far more than he has. Make him do it. It's not fair." And my dad would always pull me aside and go, "Well, your mum and I have spent the day working. It's our house. Your mum's cooked. It's she's put all this work into it. If you want to talk about fair, you don't come off well here." But that sense of actually, while I might have done more than my brother, and to this day I stand by that, that actually, I'm not after fairness here. That and I think that's in that parable. It's what it comes down to, that actually both those guys neither are perfect, and if God's perfect, no one can stand before him and go, I want my due, I want fairness. We have to go, I want forgiveness. And I think ultimately that's what I think the gospel offers, and that's what Jesus is all about. So I think the language of everyone's a sinner is it's that everyone's imperfect.
Yeah.
And while we may not want to point at someone and go, oh, you've done bad things, because we don't want to put ourselves ahead of anyone, we just
I think, and that's another quite interesting thing about coming at this from the outside, is the language of the Bible is not always, it is not the language of 2021 by any stretch. And so that's and for someone who doesn't necessarily believe in God or know the Bible very well, some of the lines even in this extract are actually quite sort of they're almost like they're kind of shocking in the language they use. A good example for me was I'm just seeing if I wrote it down. It was a line about hate. And I'm sort of working on the assumption I was not interpreting hate in the way that they meant me to. But it's anyone who does not hate father and mother, wife and children, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. The language in that line to an outsider is like, what? that's kind of shocking,
yeah.
That's something that's quite interesting to sort of. And I think in the Old Testament, especially, some of the language is even more sort of harsh. As someone who doesn't normally, read the Bible, it's quite a shock to the system sometimes. Like there are some lines that provoke quite a strong response.
Yeah, and I think sometimes that's intentional. So I think actually in this passage, Jesus, and by everyone's reaction in it, I think you see that Jesus is intentionally being like, I'm going to use the sort of harshest language I can to really shock people into listening. And I think I'd also continue to put it into like the context of what. So in that bit, what he goes on to say is he compares it to, was it a foundation, I think, and sort of you can't build a tower without a good foundation. And so I was very much saying, okay, well, if that's the sort of explanation he gives, then I think what he's saying is that, he's using shocking language to say that anything else that we're trying to build our lives upon, our foundations, that they in some way, they will fail. one way or another, and that the things we can rely on, that you can try and build your life on them, but they will let you down, or they can let you down. So I think, here when he's talking about family, when often family is that bedrock and is that foundation, but what if your family life isn't good? What are you building your life on? Or what if family dynamics change? They may not be better or worse, but that they're just different. Then that's shifted, and so actually you need a foundation that's constant if you're going to build a worldview, an outlook, even I think just sort of emotional stability. I think that's something that is concrete and isn't shifting. And then I think he also uses the language of hate to also go, well, okay, if you need, his point being that you need to build that foundation on God. That's the external, that's the constant. And in comparison, everything else, you should rely on that so much. In comparison, it looks like hate. I think that's intentionally, it's not saying to actually hate your mum and dad.
Yeah.
I think what you're picking up on there is the fact that, like all of us, when we're trying to make a point, and perhaps as Jesus tells these stories or uses this kind of rhetoric, I suppose, that exaggeration can sometimes be an aid to what we're saying, that really harsh language, if we just take it completely out of context and take it as like an instruction that you should hate those around you, it just sits really uneasily with everything else that Jesus says, especially if we flip back a few chapters where he's saying, love your enemies, not even just your family and your friends, love your enemies, pray for them. And so, maybe that's quite a helpful thing that you've said there, Tim, and maybe that helps us with the parables as well, sometimes when they seem a bit confusing, to realise that Jesus isn't always being completely clear in what he's saying, that he does use different rhetorical strategies to make his point, which is probably quite expected if we think about the great communicators of our time, but sometimes we probably wish that Jesus would just say exactly what he meant every single time so that we didn't have to work it out. That's fun. Were there any other questions or particular stories that really struck a chord with either of you?
One that, I'll be honest, I just didn't follow was near the end, talking about the Son of Man. So it seemed to be quite a sort of almost apocalyptic story, and there were sort of references to the Ark and how, shortly before the Ark, people were carrying on as normal. I guess, something I was intrigued about is what is going on with this Son of Man? Is this some kind of reference to like a judgment day or something, or have I got that wrong?
Yeah, so I think the bit we talk about is in chapter 17, just for anyone listening at home. And it's entitled in the NIV. These little titles are added afterwards by people who are translating it, so they weren't in the original. It was called The Coming of the Kingdom of God. And as you say, they're sort of, the Pharisees are asking, when's the kingdom going to come? And Jesus says, well, you're getting this a bit wrong. You're not going to be able to see it in the stars or anything like that. Actually, the kingdom is right here. He says in verse 21, the kingdom of God is in your midst. And I think he's sort of trying to say the kingdom of God is where I am. But then he sort of says that you're going to long to see me soon, but you won't. The Son of Man is Jesus' kind of title for himself. Time and time again, people call him other things in the Bible, in the New Testament, in these Gospels. They call him the Christ or whatever. And he always, very often says afterwards, the Son of Man will do this. He says like his little nickname for himself. But then, he sort of says the time is coming when, yeah, I guess you're probably right, maybe the end times, and you're not going to be able to see it coming. It's not going to be expected. And there's that sort of, people will be doing ordinary things just as they were in this Old Testament story that we can go back and read in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, where people were just going about their ordinary lives, when the awful things that people have been doing, their sin, I guess, as we were talking about earlier, caught up with them and judgment was brought on them. And so, I wonder if that is at all helpful, but do you guys have any comments on what I've just said there?
So do you think it's do you think there is a clear sort of message in that section that such a judgment day will come again? Do you think that's a fair thing to take away from that?
I think the specifics in pretty much all of the bits in the Bible that talk about a judgment and a basically the end, that the specifics are often sort of imagery and just pointers, but not all the stories emphasize, okay, the point isn't look out for this detail and then it's coming, kind of. But I think that actually all good things come to an end, and I think there's going to be a time when when people, 3 of us are going to die at some point. That's a cheery note. And
I think there's a helpful thing there in that if you are a Christian, if you read the Bible, you can't escape this big theme in the whole of the Bible, that there is going to be an end to what we know, that the time we know on earth right now is not the end of the story. And that perhaps is a profoundly relieving thing, because there's so much brokenness and hurt and difficulty and oppression in the world that we live in. And I guess the Christian story is that one day that's going to be not the case anymore, and that the sin that we talked about, the bad things that we do to one another and to ourselves and to God, will come to an end, and God has got a better future for the world as a whole and for individual people and communities of people. And so it's a picture of there will be justice, there'll be final justice one day, which I think is quite a big topic for us, and it feels really imposing and it feels really scary sometimes for us to think about that, a judgment day. But at the same time, I've been reminded recently so much of those people who've gone through awful suffering at the hands of other people. For them to hear that there wasn't going to be justice would be actually a really awful thing, much worse. And I was watching the documentary Athlete A. Have you guys seen that?
Yes, I have.
Really, really good documentary, but it's basically focusing on US gymnastics and the really awful abuses of really young gymnasts by a particular guy called Larry Nassar. And there's a really powerful speech that one of the gymnasts involved, called Rachel Den Hollander, gives as part of the court case against this guy. And she points out that, like, what is a little girl worth, is kind of her point. Like, it doesn't matter just as much like who these things are, what things are being done, but also who they're being done against. Increases the gravity of what our actions are, like the effect that our actions are having. And I suppose if you said to that little girl, like, there's not going to be justice, as there so often isn't in our world at the moment, that would be really hard to take. And so that idea of one day there will be an end to all darkness and an end to all these things, and the things that we do in this world and that other people have done to us matter to God, I think is actually a pretty comforting thing. But I wonder what you think about that, both of you, that idea of a final coming of judgment and justice. Is that something, like in these stories, that is an imposing and confusing concept?
So I think as a non-religious person, and I don't want to rule out conclusively that life ends at death. That's not something I'd feel confident saying conclusively. But yeah, my perception of the world at the moment is very much that I don't see beyond death. And so this idea that justice could come after death, I find very hard to kind of engage with, I guess. And yeah, a lot of it seems to me that a lot of Christianity is, and a lot of the way that suffering and bad things in the world are justified by Christianity is this sort of idea that after death things will be put right, and this is all part of the challenge that we face while alive on earth. So I think taking sort of buying into that argument when you can't see sort of beyond the life on earth is one of the hardest things to do if you're not a religious person.
I think I actually mentioned this to Susie before you came on, but this is some of the stuff that I was thinking through before getting baptized and deciding, okay, do I basically is this mine or not? And part of the reason that I got baptized, Louis, is because in, I think it was either year 10 or 11, you asked me, just sort of very flippantly off the bat, you went, would you be a Christian if it weren't for your family? And I didn't know. And so I bugged me for ages, like genuinely ages. And I spent, that was year 10, 11. I got baptized summer before year 13, I think.
Yeah.
And basically got sort of thinking that, okay, why do I believe in a God, and then why the Christian God? And part of that is, well, what are the alternatives? And I think, I don't claim to have done this completely sort of neutrally, but I think there's a certain element of looking at everything that life offers and going, okay, what does that, as evidence, what does that suggest? And I think one of the things is that this sense of morality that we have, this sort of a morality and justice, that this idea that things matter. I think that's innate, but I think we'd all agree that things matter and there is morality and there is right and wrong. We might sometimes differ on what those are, but the fact that we know that there is something that is right or wrong. And I don't think that is dealt with if this life is all there is, and if we died, and that's it. That worldview, I don't think doesn't explain morality, or justice, I think, or what you do with suffering.
That's actually extremely interesting, because if someone said to me, do bad things in the world provoke a strong response within me? I'd say yes, of course. I feel incredibly strongly about suffering in the world. It makes me angry. But I guess, if, that, like, why do I have that kind of moral reaction to things, if not for some bigger purpose? I don't have a good answer to that. I don't know. To me, I'd just say, well, it's just how I am. It's part of my nature, but that feels weak. So that's interesting as a sort of, I've never heard that justification for, that way of justifying faith, I guess, before. That's very interesting to think about. If I were to go and ponder that for a few months, could I come up with a better answer without involving a religion? I don't know. I might actually try and
if you do, let me know.
I will. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. No, and there are, for someone who sort of you kind of you can tussle between the this question of why is hard to answer, and as someone who I do routinely, and I'm sure this really annoys more devout Christians than me, but I do routinely go to church on Christmas Eve, and I'm one of those, and I do every time think there must be something in when you're surrounded by people who believe something and they follow it so faithfully, it's very hard to think there's got to be something in this, and there are these incredibly like compelling reasons for a God to exist. And that's an interesting one. Is what is the point in why are we not all just why do we have such a strong sense of right and wrong if not for a higher purpose? I don't know.
It's fair.
Yeah, and I wonder if I think it was in this section, one of the things that Jesus pulls out helps us to see why maybe sometimes we aren't actually able to cross that line and say, actually, I'm gonna believe this and live this life as well. Because I think you're right, it's hard for us to be open to those things in the first place, but actually sometimes when we hear like different reasons why people believe a certain thing, whether that's about faith in this case, or I don't know, why I should eat vegetables or whatever, there's a certain extent where we can listen to all these different reasons why we believe and think, there must be something here. But then Jesus talks about in chapter 14 how there are these people who've been traveling with Jesus. They've been seeing him do all these miracles and hearing him teach. And it's, I think, the bit where you talked about, okay, it's not. Oh yeah, if anyone doesn't hate their brothers and sisters, they can't follow me. And I think maybe that's partly what he's saying in this section, that it's also about what you're willing to change, whether you're willing to give your life and make that kind of sacrifice for this. Because being a Christian is not meant to be something that's easy. Jesus says, like, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves, which doesn't sound like a particularly cushy existence, being a sheep in the middle of a load of wolves. And there's a change in our lives that we embrace if we become a Christian. So I wonder if part of the reason that for some people stops them from actually becoming a Christian is not because they have a better alternative in their minds in a kind of philosophical way, but actually because they're not willing to change their life. And I don't know if that resonates with either of you.
I think so. I regard it as a more sort of. I think I would say that I don't really feel so where it's a challenge to me. It's too big a challenge to me there seem to be too many points in religion where you just have to accept something that is uncomfortable for me to kind of whereas possibly that idea is more about me being willing to change to open myself up. I would say that potentially I feel that religion hasn't opened itself up to me enough for me to sort of buy in. There seem to be too many. It's like there seem to be too many holes in the manifesto, as it were, for me to buy in. So I would say that I need to know more from religion, not the other way around. And again, I don't quite know if I guess that'd be my response, is that I don't feel religion has given me enough. Although potentially I should. But there might be a meeting in the middle. If I were to become a Christian, I'd definitely, there would definitely need to be that sort of openness from me too. It's an interesting one.
I think, this is, and sort of, I'm not saying I explored this brilliantly, but sort of before getting baptized, the sort of, I think, Lou, what you're getting at is sort of evidential side of things. That, yeah, I think that's sort of something that bugged me as well. That, like, do I believe this stuff because I've been told it, or do I believe it because I think that's where the evidence leads? And yeah, there's a lot of really, really interesting books that I found, and so one thing, so Cold Case Christianity, and this sort of lawyer, which is what I liked it, that goes through the evidence, and kind of, he looked at it, sort of, it's a very classic intending to disprove kind of argument, and then decided he didn't want to, and yeah, and he basically, he goes through a whole bunch of arguments and alternatives of what to do with the evidence of, you know, the historical value of the Gospels and the eyewitness accounts and all that, and sort of what the alternatives are, and concludes that actually that he thinks the evidence points to a resurrected Jesus. For me, that was really important, that I could go, okay, not only do I believe this, and I think it makes sense sort of philosophically, but I think there are things to point to it actually happening and the resurrection being a historical fact. But yeah.
As someone who is, I think, and that kind of, that lawyer argument is interesting, because lawyers are so based in, facts and what is the truth, So that kind of approaching religion from that sort of lawyer's perspective is an interesting thing to think about. And I think from the outside, I would say that the lawyer would struggle fundamentally to give an opinion on religion, because to me it seems so much based in faith and not fact. And yes, a lawyer who can comprehensively sit on either side of the fence, to me, is quite surprising. But I think, that's.
I wonder if this might be a helpful way to think about faith, as rather than just faith in a particular set of truths and a particular set of kind of facts, I guess, or statements about reality, if we think about faith in the way that we would say to a friend who was, going out for a job promotion or something, so I have faith in you, I believe in you, you can do this, I know your character, I know your skills, I have faith in you. Whether we can slightly flip our understanding of what it means to be a Christian, not just as faith in a set of beliefs, but as faith in a person. I wonder if that changes slightly what it means to have faith.
Yeah, it's a lighter hearted faith, isn't it? It's like, I would feel much less. Yeah, I'd feel, if I were to say now, you've got this, I believe in you to smash that interview. That's a much less scary thing to do than to say, I have faith in the existence of God.
And I think what we see in the Bible is, throughout a load of different books of different genres, history, like the Book of Luke that we've been seeing, poetry, all sorts of different types of literature, what we build up is a picture of the God that Jesus is saying he is, and the God that Jesus is saying we should have faith in. And so it's not that it's not evidence-based, if that makes sense, but it's also faith in a person rather than in a belief system. The early church and the early Christians, the first Christians, wouldn't probably have had a set of sort of statements of belief that you're in if you believe these, or you're out, but they were the people who followed Jesus, and a lot of those kind of specific beliefs crystallized along the way. And so, yeah, being a Christian today, I wonder if you'd agree with this, Tim, is less about having kind of just a statement of loads of beliefs, as much as there will be things that you believe and things that you don't believe, but actually faith in the specific person of Jesus as revealed in these books, historical accounts of his life. So kind of the faith in the person and the faith in the evidence are kind of intertwined.
Yeah, and I think this might be splitting hairs slightly, but I think I wouldn't describe it as, I think I believe that a God exists. I have faith in the character of Jesus, and the difference that I think the evidence points to. Yeah, I think the evidence points to an existence of a God and the character of Jesus and death and resurrection. But I think the faith element is faith being sort of the description of sticking by what you know to be true, and that I would separate it from an evidential, that it's not faith or evidence, it's evidence, and that's a whole sort of, I guess, almost first step for me. And then faith is, do I trust this character? Am I faithful to God, and do I have faith in God in that sense? I definitely wouldn't want it to be framed as sort of belief without evidence. I think it was quite, as I said, the whole sort of deciding to get baptized was, I definitely wanted to be sure that that's wasn't what I had.
So this might not be a fair question to ask, but if you had to pick, one, is there a piece of evidence that you would say, do you have like one, from this sort of bank of evidence that you have, do you have anything particularly that you think is completely infallible as a sort of a piece of evidence for the existence of, for Christianity? Is that a fair thing to ask you for?
I think it depends what you mean by infallible.
Yeah, that was a strong word. Sorry.
Yeah. I think I would want to say, like, one of the things is I think that, so like the whole book of Luke, I think, is a historical document. I think, at the beginning he introduces it. It's this letter that he introduces with, I'm writing these accounts of the people that saw Jesus, so that you'll believe. So yeah, I think that has evidential value, that Luke sort of describes it in the book and lays out what people have told him, and then the book that follows that in the Bible is Acts, and that's just the description of the church straight after Jesus, and sort of lays out what they did. So I think you have this event, whatever, Jesus' death and whatever you think sort of happened there. You've got these people writing the books and writing these gospels like Luke, and then you have these same people going on, in a lot of cases, to suffer, to die, to, I think that makes their testimony, their eyewitness value, I think that's quite credible, mainly on the fact that, I don't know about you, I'm not willing to die for something I've lied about, but, and these characters that have, they say they've seen God, they've seen Jesus do this, they've seen him resurrected, and then they're telling people about it, and that's getting them in trouble. And your options are either they're telling the truth, they're lying, or it's sort of mass delusion. I don't think mass delusion is sort of convincing in the slightest, with sort of what happens with sort of the numbers, the whole situation, and then they're either lying or it's true. And yeah, the fact that this is really not worth lying about. No one comes to power. No one has anything to gain, sort of, in sort of worldly terms. That yeah, so I think that they are quite credible. And there's whole sort of there's a book called "Can We Trust the Gospels?" By a guy that actually goes to my church, and basically going through like really sort of minute details of, okay, why do we think that the gospel, the four gospels are accurate? What makes us think that they are sort of reliable historical documents? I think that's also, I think, got quite a lot of quite good points.
That is really interesting. I think it's quite interesting as well, because if you say to me, do I believe that Jesus, the person, existed? I say yes, like partly because of these gospels are too detailed to be completely made up, man, So I don't have at what point do I stop believing? I'm not totally sure. I don't know where I draw the line particularly, but because I would say with quite a lot of confidence, the person that the Gospels are describing existed. He has to have done. There is too much detail in those things, and there's too much sort of accuracy between the four different Gospels for it to be completely, made up story. I don't believe that. So then where do I stop believing? I'm not sure. I don't think I believe that after Jesus died, he then came back to life. But then why the hell did he, you're right. He was willing to die for this thing. If someone was going to call his bluff, was he they pushed him to the absolute limit. So yeah, I'm not sure at what point I stopped believing.
I think for me also the bit where Jesus is absolute clearest about who he is in the trial just before his death. Throughout the Gospels, when he does miracles, he usually, a lot of the healings, he goes, don't tell anyone, and people do anyway. But then at the trial, the high priest asks him, says, are you? I can't remember exactly, but basically, are you the Messiah? And he basically outs himself, yes. At which point the high priest tears his robe. It's blasphemy, and they're going to kill him for that. And well, if you're trying to start a rebellion, that's the wrong way to go about it. If you're trying to start a religion, maybe come out with that a bit clearer earlier. But whereas if you've got an authentic truth that you are not trying to gain from, that's how it would play out.
Yeah, I can't think of a good reason for that to have happened, and again, do I believe that if I believe that Jesus existed, do I then reject every account of miracles that he performed, and that of which there are a few in the chapter that the chapter that we're talking about today? Do I believe that those then didn't happen? I think probably. I'm not sure. But then again, there's so much detail there. It's very hard. It's hard to, yeah. No, it's a very compelling point.
I think it's really hard for us situated as we are in our own lives and our own experiences to get to grips with this in a neutral way. I think what we've said, and just really love the honesty of both of you guys, what you've just said, is actually really hard for us to approach it with eyes that aren't already biased towards a particular way of seeing it. If we don't see miracles happening all the time in our own lives, and if we've grown up believing that miracles aren't a thing, it's actually really hard for us to then come to these accounts and read them all consistently. And so I just think it'd be really interesting for maybe you guys can sit down together and like read the rest of the account of Luke. Like, we've only read a little bit of it, and just like see how it plays out. And I think for anyone listening as well, if you haven't considered the evidence, whether you're a Christian, whether you're not a Christian, have you considered this? Have you read these first century, really early accounts, eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life? Have you considered that evidence and seen where that takes you? Have we actually investigated and interrogated our own belief systems? And if not, maybe it might be worthwhile us doing a bit of that, because as we were talking about earlier, this whole stuff about justice and judgment and what we do matters. We have that real sense of this sort of thing matters. So I think it's got to be the most worthwhile thing for us to do, to really investigate why that matters and what we can do about it. So yeah, thanks so much both. I think we've brought out some really cool points there, and maybe it kind of climaxes in that, have we actually looked at the evidence with as fresh eyes as we can? Maybe we can end with that encouragement for us to all just go back and do that again. So thanks so much both of you for joining. I've really, really loved hearing all that you both had to say. So yeah, thanks.
No, thank you. That was really interesting. And I did come into this feeling like a kid who hadn't done my homework, and that's probably a bad thing.
No, I mean, yeah, I think it's crazy how many of us for so much of our lives just don't examine our own beliefs and don't examine our own way of seeing the world. And so, yeah, I didn't mean that at all to, like, as a slight or anything.
No, and I didn't mean it either. But yeah, I don't feel I don't have clear justifications for being non-religious in a way that I expect religious people to have them for being religious, and that's probably not reasonable of me. So it's an interesting thing to think about.
And just really honest as well to be able to say that. Like, I just really want to affirm you in that, being able to say, actually, do you know what, I haven't investigated this properly, I haven't got reasons that I'd expect others to have. Like, it's amazing to be able to say that. So yeah, it's cool. Amazing. Well, let's come into land, because we can't go on forever as much as I would like to. But yeah, it's been a real pleasure chatting to both of you and meeting you, Louis.
No, nice to meet you too. That was a very interesting hour.
Yeah, I bet. Well, you guys can chat more in the days and years to come, I'm sure. But yeah, it's been a pleasure to just join you guys and see a little bit of your friendship as well. And just how like respectful and lovely you both are, and you're chatting with each other even if you don't always agree on everything. So yeah,
it's only because you're here.
Amazing.
Susie. Oh,
yeah. You can invite me along to all your little discussions if you want. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Luke Experiment podcast. To find out more and to listen to the rest of the series, head to storycambridge.uk, where there'll be a new episode released every 2 days.